The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and corporate ambition, when Marcus Caldwell's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you all to meet our newest team member," he announced, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Though I'm not sure how much help she'll be, considering she can barely walk across the room without that cane." The laughter that followed was immediate and cruel, echoing off the glass walls of the 32nd floor boardroom. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me, some amused, others uncomfortable, all waiting to see how I would react. I kept my expression neutral, my fingers steady around the handle of my walking cane, and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone except me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and that morning in September was supposed to be my fresh start. After 22 years in the Army, including 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, I had finally decided to transition into civilian life. The shrapnel in my left leg from an IED explosion in Kandahar had earned me a Purple Heart and a permanent limp, but it had also given me something else. A burning desire to prove that my worth wasn't measured by how fast I could walk. The law firm of Caldwell, Harrison & Associates occupied 4 floors of a gleaming Manhattan high-rise, and Marcus Caldwell was the kind of man who wore his success like expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. At 45, he had built his reputation on corporate mergers and acquisitions, the kind of deals that made headlines and broke companies. His corner office overlooked Central Park, and his Armani suits cost more than most people's monthly rent. I had been hired as a senior paralegal, a position that should have commanded respect given my extensive background in military law and my recently completed paralegal certification. My resume was impressive: decorated veteran, Bronze Star recipient, expert in contract law and military justice. But none of that seemed to matter to Marcus as he continued his impromptu comedy routine at my expense. "I mean, we're all for diversity here," he said, loosening his silk tie with practiced ease. "But I'm wondering if we should have installed a wheelchair ramp just to be safe." Another wave of nervous laughter rippled through the room. Sarah Chen, the junior associate sitting closest to me, shifted uncomfortably in her chair and avoided eye contact. James Morrison, one of the partners, cleared his throat but said nothing. The morning had started differently. I had arrived at the office at 7:30, an hour before my official start time, because punctuality had been drilled into me during my military service. The security guard, an older black man with kind eyes, had welcomed me warmly. "First day?" he had asked, and when I nodded, he smiled. "You'll do fine. Just remember, respect is earned here, not given." His name was William, I learned later, and he was a Vietnam veteran who had worked security in the building for over 15 years. He had recognized something in me, the way veterans often do. A certain bearing, a way of holding oneself that comes from having faced real danger and survived it. The law firm's offices were a testament to wealth and power. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and original artwork adorned the walls. Everything was designed to intimidate, to remind visitors and employees alike that they were in the presence of serious money. The reception area alone probably cost more than my entire military pension for a year. But I wasn't intimidated. I had briefed generals in war zones, had made life and death decisions while mortars fell around me, had held the hand of a dying soldier while calling in medical evacuation under heavy fire. A fancy law office, no matter how expensive, couldn't shake me. My supervisor was supposed to be Patricia Williams, a senior paralegal with 20 years of experience. She had seemed genuinely pleased to have me on the team during our phone interview, especially when she learned about my military background. "We need someone with your discipline and attention to detail," she had said. Corporate law can be a battlefield in its own way. But Patricia was out sick that morning, which was how I ended up in Marcus Caldwell's crosshairs during what should have been a routine staff meeting. He had been discussing a major merger when he noticed me sitting quietly in the back corner, taking notes on my tablet. Well, he had said, interrupting his own presentation. "Looks like our wounded warrior decided to join us." The casual cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. He said it the way someone might comment on the weather, as if my disability was simply an interesting observation rather than a part of my life that had cost me months of physical therapy and countless sleepless nights. The backstory of how I had ended up there was complicated, rooted in decisions I had made years earlier that were only now bearing fruit. After my medical retirement from the Army, I had spent 2 years in a dark place, struggling with phantom pain and the psychological weight of everything I had seen and done. The transition from military to civilian life is never easy, but when you add a physical disability and PTSD to the mix, it becomes a journey through hell. My therapist, Dr. Maria Santos, had been the one to suggest that I needed a purpose beyond my pain. "You're a natural leader," she had told me during one of our sessions. "You understand systems, you understand how organizations work. Maybe it's time to use those skills in a different arena." The idea of law school had seemed impossible at first. How could someone who sometimes needed a cane to walk compete in such a demanding field? But Dr. Santos had introduced me to other veterans who had made similar transitions, and slowly, I began to believe it might be possible. I started with online courses while I was still doing physical therapy. Constitutional law, contract law, civil procedure. I devoured the material with the same intensity I had once brought to military strategy. My grades were exceptional, but more importantly, I found that I loved the intellectual challenge. Law was like a puzzle, and I had always been good at puzzles. The paralegal certification was a stepping stone, a way to get my foot in the door while I continued working toward my law degree. I had applied to dozens of firms, but Caldwell, Harrison & Associates had been the only one to offer me a position that paid well enough to support myself while attending law school part-time. What Marcus Caldwell didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my military service had taught me more than just law. It had taught me about strategy, about patience, about waiting for the right moment to act. Most importantly, it had taught me that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions, not your words. The conference room that morning was filled with the firm's senior staff, 3 partners, 6 associates, and a handful of paralegals and support staff. They were all watching the show Marcus was putting on, some laughing along, others looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. It was a perfect microcosm of corporate culture, the powerful preying on the vulnerable while the bystanders watched in silence. Marcus wasn't finished with his performance. He leaned against the conference table, his expensive watch catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I'm just saying, we might want to make sure all our emergency exits are clearly marked. Wouldn't want anyone getting left behind if we have to evacuate quickly." The comment hit like a physical blow. He was referencing something that every veteran fears, being a burden, being the weak link that puts others at risk. It was a fear I had lived with since my injury, the worry that my physical limitations would somehow endanger the people around me. But he had chosen the wrong fear to exploit. Because the truth was,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Had never been left behind. Even after the IED explosion that had torn through our convoy, even with shrapnel in my leg and blood soaking through my uniform, I had continued to lead my unit. I had called in air support, coordinated the medical evacuation of wounded soldiers, and held our position until reinforcements arrived. The bronze star on my chest wasn't for getting injured. It was for what I did after I was injured. Sarah Chen finally found her voice. "Marcus, maybe we should focus on the merger presentation," she said quietly, her discomfort obvious. She was a Harvard Law graduate, brilliant and ambitious, but she was also junior enough that challenging a partner directly was risky. Marcus waved her off dismissively. "Oh, we'll get to that. I just think it's important that everyone understands our new team dynamics." He turned his attention back to me, his smile predatory. "Elena, isn't it? Tell us, what exactly qualifies you to work on multi-million-dollar deals? I mean, besides your obvious limitations." The room fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when I would either fight back or fold. In the military, we called it a defining moment, one of those instances where your response shapes not just the immediate situation, but your entire future relationship with the people around you. I could have told them about my education, about my military service, about the commendations and the years of experience that had brought me to that room. I could have recited my qualifications like a resume come to life. But something deeper was at work here, something that required a different kind of response. Instead, I simply nodded politely and said, I'm looking forward to contributing to the team's success." My voice was calm, professional, giving away nothing of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the marble and glass. "Well, that's certainly diplomatic. I suppose they teach you that in the army, right? How to follow orders without asking questions." He had no idea how wrong he was. The military had taught me many things, but blind obedience wasn't one of them. It had taught me how to assess a situation, how to identify the real power structures, how to wait for the right moment to act. Most importantly, it had taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remain silent and let your enemies reveal themselves. James Morrison, the senior partner, finally intervened. "Marcus, perhaps we should move on to the Morrison Industries merger. We have a lot to cover this morning." But Marcus wasn't ready to let go of his moment in the spotlight. Of course. But first, I think we should make sure Elena understands the pace we work at here. This isn't the government, where things move slowly and there's always time for accommodations. We work fast, we work hard, and we don't have time to slow down for anyone. The irony was staggering. He was lecturing me about pace and pressure while I sat there thinking about mortar rounds and split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. He was talking about working hard to someone who had spent years in combat zones where working hard meant staying alive for another day. Patricia Williams arrived just as Marcus was winding down his performance. She took one look at the tension in the room and immediately understood what had happened. Patricia was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had worked her way up from secretary to senior paralegal through sheer determination and competence. She had served as a Navy corpsman before law school, and she recognized the look on my face. "Elena," she said briskly, "let's get you settled at your workstation. We have the Morrison Industries documents to review, and I want to bring you up to speed on the filing requirements." It was a lifeline, professionally thrown, and I took it gratefully. As I stood to leave with Patricia, Marcus couldn't resist one final shot. "Try not to trip on your way out," he called after me, loud enough for everyone to hear. The laughter that followed was smaller this time, more uncomfortable, but it still stung. Patricia waited until we were in her office before she spoke. "I'm sorry about that," she said simply. "Marcus can be difficult." Difficult was a polite way of putting it. Marcus Caldwell was a bully, the kind of person who used his position and power to humiliate others for his own entertainment. But bullies, I had learned, often had weaknesses that weren't immediately apparent. "It's fine," I told Patricia, and I meant it. "I've dealt with worse." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "I imagine you have. Well, let's get to work. The Morrison merger is a big one, $200 million, and the timeline is tight. I could use someone with your attention to detail." The work was exactly what I needed. Corporate mergers are incredibly complex, involving hundreds of documents, regulatory filings, and legal precedents. Every detail has to be perfect because a single mistake can derail a deal worth millions of dollars. It was the kind of high-stakes, detail-oriented work that played to my strengths. I spent the morning reviewing contracts and cross-referencing compliance requirements. The documents told the story of two companies coming together, each with their own culture and operating procedures. Morrison Industries was a family-owned manufacturing company that had been in business for 60 years. They made specialized components for the aerospace industry, and their reputation for quality was impeccable. The acquiring company was Caldwell Enterprises, a privately held investment firm that specialized in buying undervalued companies and quote 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 quote. Reading between the lines of the merger documents, it was clear that quote 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 trade IT-tation usually meant layoffs and cost-cutting measures designed to maximize short-term profits. What struck me as I reviewed the paperwork was how little Marcus seemed to understand about Morrison Industries' actual business. The financial projections were based on industry averages rather than the company's specific market position. The due diligence reports were superficial, focusing on obvious metrics while missing some significant operational details. But there was something else, something that made me pause as I cross-referenced the ownership documents. The merger agreement listed Caldwell Enterprises as acquiring 51% of Morrison Industries, giving them controlling interest. But buried in the supporting documents was a reference to a silent partner in Caldwell Enterprises, someone identified only as Rodriguez Holdings, LLC. The name stopped me cold. Rodriguez was my last name, but it was also common enough that it could be a coincidence. Except that as I dug deeper into the corporate filings, I found something that made my heart race. Rodriguez Holdings, LLC was incorporated in Delaware 3 years earlier, and the registered agent was Martinez, Hernandez and Associates, the law firm that had handled my investment portfolio after my military settlement. My hands were shaking as I opened my laptop and logged into my investment account. The numbers on the screen confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The disability settlement from my military service, combined with my combat pay savings and a surprisingly successful investment strategy, had grown into a substantial portfolio. But more than that, my financial advisor had recommended diversifying into private equity investments, including a fund that specialized in manufacturing companies. I had signed the papers without paying much attention to the details. After years of military life where every decision was made for you, I had been happy to let someone else handle the complexities of civilian investing. But now, staring at the merger documents, I realized that I owned a controlling interest in the very fund that was acquiring Morrison Industries. Which meant that Marcus Caldwell, the man who had spent the morning mocking my disability and questioning my qualifications, was about to work for me. The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. Here was a man who had built his career on acquiring companies and exercising control over others, and he had no idea that his biggest deal was with someone he had just humiliated in front of his entire staff. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing through the implications. The merger was scheduled to close in 2 weeks, which meant that very soon Marcus would discover that his wounded warrior actually held the controlling interest in his acquisition target. The power dynamic he had so casually exploited that morning was about to shift in a way he could never have imagined. But more than that, I realized that this was my opportunity to prove something bigger than just my competence as a paralegal. This was my chance to show that underestimating someone based on their disability was not just morally wrong, it was strategically stupid. The afternoon brought more of the same from Marcus. He made a point of walking past my desk several times, each time making some comment about my special needs or questioning whether I was keeping up with the pace of work. His audience had grown smaller. Most of the staff had returned to their own duties, but he seemed determined to establish a pattern of behavior. "Elena," he called out around 3 o'clock, "are you sure you can handle those Morrison documents? They're pretty complex, and I wouldn't want you to strain yourself." I looked up from my computer, where I had been cross-referencing regulatory filings and building a comprehensive timeline of the merger process. "I'm managing fine, thank you," I said evenly. "Just checking," he said with that same predatory smile. "You know, in my experience, people with challenges sometimes overestimate their capabilities. It's important to know your limitations." The comment was designed to provoke a reaction, to get me to either defend myself or back down. But I had learned something important during my military service. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. I simply nodded and returned to my work. What Marcus didn't know was that I was building something, not just completing the paralegal work he had assigned, but constructing a comprehensive understanding of his business practices and the merger itself. Every document I reviewed, every filing I cross-referenced, was giving me insight into how he operated and where his vulnerabilities might lie. By the end of the day, I had a complete picture of the Morrison Industries acquisition. It was a good deal for Caldwell Enterprises, but only if they understood the industry dynamics and managed the integration properly. Based on what I had seen in Marcus's approach, I had serious doubts about both. More importantly, I had confirmed my ownership stake and begun to understand the full scope of my accidental power. Rodriguez Holdings, LLC didn't just have a minority stake in the acquiring fund, it held 51%, making me the controlling shareholder. In 2 weeks, when the merger closed, I would have effective control over a company worth more than $200 million. As I packed up my things to leave that first day, Patricia approached my desk. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. "Interesting," I replied, which was the understatement of the century. She glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "Marcus has a history of this kind of behavior. HR has received complaints before, but nothing ever sticks. He's too valuable to the firm's bottom line." "I understand," I said, and I did. Corporate culture often protected people like Marcus because their financial contributions outweighed their personal failings. It was a calculation I had seen before in the military, where sometimes valuable assets were protected despite their flaws. "If you need anything, let me know," Patricia said. "And don't let him get to you. You're good at this work, better than he realizes." As I made my way to the elevator, I passed William at the security desk. He looked up from his newspaper and smiled. "How was the first day?" "Educational," I said, which made him chuckle. "They always are," he replied. "Remember what I told you this morning? Respect is earned here, but once you earn it, it sticks." The elevator ride down to the lobby gave me 32 floors to think about what had happened and what was coming next. In 2 weeks, Marcus Caldwell was going to discover that the woman he had spent the day mocking was actually his new boss. The question was how to handle that revelation in a way that would be most effective. I could have called the law firm that managed my investments and had them reach out immediately. I could have revealed my identity during the merger negotiations and watched Marcus scramble to repair the damage he had done. But that would be reactive, emotional, and ultimately unsatisfying. Instead, I decided to wait. I would continue working as a paralegal, documenting every interaction, every slight, every example of Marcus's unprofessional behavior. When the merger closed and my ownership was revealed, I would have a complete record of exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. More than that, I would have demonstrated something important, that competence and character matter more than physical ability. Marcus had dismissed me based on my disability, but I was about to show him that his prejudice had blinded him to a reality he never saw coming. The subway ride home to my small apartment in Queens gave me time to process everything that had happened. 24 hours earlier, I had been a newly hired paralegal hoping to prove herself in a competitive field. Now I was a majority shareholder in a multi-million-dollar company, with the power to shape not just my own future but the futures of everyone who worked for Morrison Industries. It was a responsibility I didn't take lightly. The military had taught me that power should be used carefully, with consideration for all the people who would be affected by your decisions. But it had also taught me that sometimes power needs to be demonstrated clearly and unmistakably, especially when dealing with bullies who mistake kindness for weakness. As I prepared dinner in my small kitchen, I thought about the soldiers I had served with, the ones who hadn't made it home and the ones who had returned with their own disabilities and challenges. Every one of them deserved to be judged by their capabilities and their character, not by their limitations or their scars. Marcus Caldwell was about to learn that lesson in the most direct way possible, and I was going to enjoy every minute of teaching it to him. That night, I made a series of phone calls. First to my financial advisor, confirming the details of my investment and the timeline for the merger. Then to Martinez, Hernandez and Associates, the law firm that had set up Rodriguez Holdings LLC, to make sure I understood all the legal implications of my position. The final call was to Dr. Santos, my therapist, who had helped me through the darkest period of my transition from military to civilian life. "Elena," she said when she heard my voice, "you sound different. What's happened?" I told her about the day, about Marcus's behavior, and about the discovery I had made regarding my investment. When I finished, there was a long pause. "How do you feel about all this?" she asked, which was exactly the question I had expected from her. "Angry," I said honestly, "but also powerful. For the first time since my injury, I feel like I have real control over my situation." "That's important," she said, "but remember what we've talked about. Revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Make sure you're pursuing the latter, not the former." It was good advice, and I knew she was right. What I was planning wasn't about hurting Marcus Caldwell. It was about demonstrating that his prejudice and cruelty had consequences. More than that, it was about proving that people with disabilities deserve the same respect and opportunities as everyone else. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even Patricia. I completed every assignment flawlessly, often going beyond what was required to provide additional analysis and recommendations. I learned the merger documents inside and out, understanding not just what they said, but what they meant for both companies. Marcus continued his campaign of small humiliations. He questioned my work publicly, made jokes about my disability in front of clients, and generally tried to establish that I was a burden the firm was carrying out of some misguided sense of charity. Each incident was carefully documented, each witness noted, each example of unprofessional behavior recorded. But I also began to understand something else about Marcus. Beneath the expensive suits and the confident bluster, he was actually insecure about his own competence. His analysis of the Morrison acquisition was superficial, his understanding of the industry dynamics limited, and his integration planning almost non-existent. He was a man who had succeeded through aggression and intimidation rather than genuine skill, and that made him vulnerable in ways he didn't realize. When the merger closed and I took control, I would need to decide not just how to deal with his behavior, but how to manage a company that had been depending on someone fundamentally incompetent. The day before the merger was scheduled to close, Marcus called an all-hands meeting to celebrate what he was calling, quote, the biggest deal in firm history. The entire staff gathered in the main conference room, the same one where he had humiliated me 2 weeks earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice filled with the kind of pride that comes from claiming credit for other people's work. Tomorrow we close the Morrison Industries acquisition. This deal will establish Caldwell Enterprises as a major player in the manufacturing sector and generate millions in revenue for this firm. He went on to describe his vision for the acquisition, which mostly involved cutting costs and maximizing efficiency. There was no mention of preserving jobs, maintaining Morrison's reputation for quality, or respecting the company's 60-year history. It was all about the bottom line and his own aggrandizement. As he spoke, I found myself thinking about the Morrison family members who still worked at the company, about the engineers and technicians who had dedicated their careers to building quality products. Marcus saw them as line items on a spreadsheet, costs to be minimized rather than assets to be valued. When he finished his presentation, he opened the floor for questions. Sarah Chen raised her hand. What's our plan for retaining key personnel during the transition? Marcus waved dismissively. We'll keep who we need and let the rest go. Manufacturing companies are always overstaffed. It's just a matter of identifying redundancies. What about Morrison's research and development division? Asked James Morrison. No relation to the company being acquired. They have several patents pending that could be valuable. R&D is usually the first place to cut costs, Marcus replied. Innovation is expensive, and our focus needs to be on immediate profitability. Each answer revealed more about his fundamental misunderstanding of what made Morrison Industries valuable. He saw only costs where he should have seen assets, only problems where he should have seen opportunities. Finally, he turned his attention to me. Elena, do you have any questions about the acquisition? I want to make sure our newest team member understands the significance of what we're accomplishing here. It was another setup, another opportunity for him to demonstrate my supposed inadequacy in front of the entire staff. But this time, I was ready. Actually, I do have a question, I said, standing slowly and steadying myself with my cane. Have you reviewed the environmental compliance requirements for Morrison's manufacturing processes? The EPA regulations for aerospace component manufacturing are quite complex, and non-compliance could result in significant penalties. The question caught him off guard. It was specific, technical, and demonstrated a level of understanding that he clearly hadn't expected from his wounded warrior. Well, yes, of course, he stammered. That's all. Been handled by our environmental law team. And what about the union contracts? I continued. Morrison has been unionized for 40 years. Have you factored the collective bargaining agreements into your efficiency projections? Now, he was clearly uncomfortable. Our labor relations people are handling those details. I see, I said politely. And the intellectual property portfolio? Morrison holds patents on several proprietary manufacturing processes that are licensed to other aerospace companies. That licensing revenue represents about 12% of their annual income. Are you planning to maintain those relationships? The room had gone completely quiet. Marcus's face was flushed, and he was clearly struggling to maintain his composure. He had built his reputation on being the smartest person in the room, but I was asking questions he couldn't answer about a deal he supposedly understood completely. Like I said, he managed, finally, we have specialists handling all those details. Of course, I replied with a slight smile. I was just curious about the strategic overview. I sat back down, leaving Marcus to finish his presentation to a room full of people who were now questioning whether he actually understood the acquisition he had been bragging about. It was a small moment of satisfaction, but it was nothing compared to what was coming the next day. That evening, I received a call from my financial advisor confirming that the merger would close the following morning. At exactly 9 a.m., Rodriguez Holdings LLC would become the majority shareholder in Morrison Industries, and Marcus Caldwell would discover that his biggest professional triumph was actually his most devastating humiliation. I spent the night reviewing my options and planning my approach. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about demonstrating that competence and character matter more than prejudice and assumptions. It was about proving that people with disabilities deserve the same respect and opportunities as everyone else. Most importantly, it was about showing that underestimating someone based on their limitations is not just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid. Tomorrow, Marcus Caldwell was going to learn that lesson in the most direct way possible, and I was going to make sure he never forgot it. The morning of the merger closing arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes Manhattan feel electric with possibility. I had been awake since 4:30, not from anxiety but from anticipation. 22 years of military training had taught me that preparation was everything, and I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. My apartment in Queens was modest but comfortable, a deliberate choice after years of military housing and temporary quarters. The walls were decorated with photographs from my service, my unit in Afghanistan, the ceremony where I received my Bronze Star, a group shot of the engineers who had worked with me on infrastructure projects in Iraq. These images served as daily reminders of who I was beneath the civilian clothes and corporate expectations. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue suit that conveyed professionalism without ostentation. The fabric was high quality but not flashy, the cut conservative but flattering. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a competent professional who happened to need a walking cane. The small American flag pin on my lapel was the only outward sign of my military service, a subtle detail that most people overlooked entirely. The commute to Manhattan gave me time to review my strategy one final time. The merger closing was scheduled for 9 o'clock in Conference Room A, the firm's most prestigious meeting space. Marcus would be there with his usual entourage of associates and paralegals, along with representatives from Morrison Industries and various lawyers handling the transaction details. What none of them knew was that I had been in communication with Morrison's CEO, Robert Morrison, for the past week. Not as Elena Rodriguez the paralegal, but as the representative of Rodriguez Holdings LLC. The conversations had been enlightening, revealing a man who genuinely cared about his family's company and was deeply concerned about the acquisition. Robert Morrison was 72 years old, a third-generation owner of the company his grandfather had founded in 1963. He had agreed to the sale reluctantly, pressured by declining market conditions and the need to secure his employees' futures. But he had serious reservations about Marcus Caldwell's plans for the company, particularly the proposed layoffs and cost-cutting measures. My conversations with Robert had been careful and strategic. I had introduced myself as an investor with a background in military logistics and manufacturing, someone who understood the value of Morrison's specialized expertise in aerospace components. I had asked detailed questions about the company's operations, its employee relationships, and its long-term challenges. What emerged from those discussions was a picture of a company that was fundamentally sound but facing short-term pressures that could be addressed with the right leadership and investment. Morrison Industries wasn't failing. It was simply caught in an industry downturn that required patience and strategic thinking to navigate. Marcus Caldwell, with his focus on immediate profitability and cost-cutting, was exactly the wrong person to steward the company through this transition. His approach would likely destroy the very qualities that made Morrison valuable: its reputation for quality, its experienced workforce, and its strong relationships with aerospace customers. This realization had crystallized my decision about how to handle the revelation of my ownership. This wasn't just about humiliating Marcus or getting revenge for his treatment of me. This was about protecting a company and its employees from someone who would damage both in pursuit of short-term profits. I arrived at the office building 45 minutes before the scheduled closing, giving myself time to review the final documents and coordinate with the legal teams involved in the transaction. William, the security guard, greeted me with his usual warm smile. "Big day today," he said, glancing at the briefcase I carried. "You look ready for whatever comes." "I hope so," I replied, which was true in ways he couldn't imagine. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt longer than usual, each floor marking another step toward a confrontation that would reshape not just my relationship with Marcus Caldwell, but potentially the entire culture of the law firm. I wasn't naive about the risks involved. Revealing my ownership stake would certainly end my career as a paralegal at Caldwell, Harrison & Associates, but it would also open doors that I couldn't yet fully envision. Patricia Williams was already at her desk when I arrived, reviewing a stack of documents that seemed to grow taller each day. She looked up as I approached, her expression thoughtful. "Elena, you've been different these past few weeks," she said quietly. "More confident, more focused. It's like you're working towards something bigger than just this job." Her observation was more perceptive than I had realized. The knowledge of my ownership stake had indeed changed how I approached my work and my interactions with the staff. Instead of feeling defensive about Marcus's attacks, I had begun to feel protective of the employees who had to endure his behavior. "Maybe I am," I said, which was as close to the truth as I could get without revealing everything. Conference Room A was a monument to corporate power, with its mahogany table that could seat 20 people, original artwork on the walls, and a view of Central Park that probably added $50,000 to the firm's annual rent. The room had been the site of countless major transactions, deals that had reshaped industries and created fortunes. By 8:45, the room was filling with participants in the Morrison acquisition. Marcus had arrived early, dressed in his most expensive suit, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're about to achieve your greatest professional triumph. He was accompanied by Sarah Chen and 2 other associates, along with Patricia and myself representing the paralegal support team. Robert Morrison sat at the opposite end of the table with his own legal team, a group of lawyers from a prestigious firm that specialized in family-owned businesses. Robert himself was a distinguished man with silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that suggested he had spent time on factory floors as well as in boardrooms. His eyes held a combination of sadness and resignation that spoke to the difficulty of selling a company his family had built over 3 generations. The transaction documents were arranged in neat stacks around the table, each pile representing a different aspect of the complex deal. Purchase agreements, environmental certifications, employment contracts, intellectual property transfers, the paperwork required to move ownership of a $200 million company from one entity to another. Marcus took his place at the head of the table, clearly relishing his role as the architect of the acquisition. He spent several minutes reviewing documents and making small talk with the other lawyers, establishing his dominance of the proceedings through casual displays of knowledge and authority. "Well, gentlemen," he said finally, checking his expensive watch, "I think we're ready to make history. This acquisition represents the largest deal in Caldwell Enterprises' portfolio, and I'm confident it will generate exceptional returns for our investors." The irony of his words was almost overwhelming. He was congratulating himself on generating returns for investors, without realizing that the primary investor was sitting 10 feet away from him, taking notes on his behavior and documenting his approach to the transaction. The closing process began with a series of routine verifications and document reviews. Each lawyer had specific responsibilities, checking various aspects of the transaction to ensure that all legal requirements had been met. As a paralegal, my role was largely observational, but I used the time to study the faces around the table and gauge the dynamics at play. Robert Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable as Marcus outlined his plans for the company. The proposed changes were even more aggressive than what had been discussed in the preliminary meetings, with deeper layoffs and more extensive cost-cutting measures than originally anticipated. We're looking at immediate workforce reductions of approximately 30%, Marcus explained to the room, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the livelihoods of hundreds of people. The manufacturing sector is overstaffed by definition, and Morrison has been carrying dead weight for years. Robert's jaw tightened at the casual dismissal of employees who had dedicated their careers to his family's company. Those people aren't dead weight, he said quietly. They're skilled technicians and engineers who understand our processes better than anyone else in the industry. Marcus waved dismissively. Sentiment is expensive, Robert. Our responsibility is to maximize efficiency and profitability. We can always hire back if needed, but it's easier to cut first and add later. The conversation revealed everything I needed to know about Marcus's approach to business and his fundamental misunderstanding of what made Morrison Industries valuable. He saw employees as costs to be minimized, rather than assets to be developed, and he had no appreciation for the institutional knowledge and customer relationships that Morrison's experienced workforce represented. Sarah Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly troubled by the callous discussion of layoffs. She caught my eye across the table, and I saw recognition there. She understood that Marcus's approach was not just morally questionable, but strategically short-sighted. The document review continued for another hour, with various lawyers checking signatures, verifying wire transfers, and confirming that all regulatory requirements had been satisfied. The process was methodical and thorough, each step bringing the transaction closer to completion. At exactly 10:30, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from the firm's managing partner. He read it quickly, then smiled with the satisfaction of a man whose greatest ambitions were about to be realized. "Gentlemen," he announced, "I've just received confirmation that all funds have been transferred and all regulatory approvals are in place. We are ready to execute the final documents and complete this acquisition." The moment had arrived. In a matter of minutes, Marcus would discover that his greatest professional triumph was actually his most devastating humiliation. The question was how to manage the revelation in a way that would be most effective and least disruptive to the other people in the room. I had considered several approaches over the past 2 weeks. I could have had my lawyers contact the firm directly, revealing my ownership stake before the closing and forcing Marcus to confront the reality of his situation in advance. I could have waited until after the documents were signed and then revealed my identity in a private meeting. Or I could handle the revelation publicly, in front of all the participants in the transaction. Each approach had advantages and disadvantages, but I had ultimately decided on a middle path. I would reveal my ownership during the closing itself, but in a way that focused on the business implications rather than the personal dynamics. This would demonstrate my competence and strategic thinking while avoiding the appearance of petty revenge. As Marcus reached for his pen to begin signing the final documents, I cleared my throat quietly. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying just enough authority to stop the proceedings without seeming confrontational. "Before we finalize everything, I think there's something that needs to be clarified." The room fell silent. Marcus looked up from the documents with barely concealed irritation. "What kind of clarification?" he asked, his tone suggesting that any delay was both unnecessary and unwelcome. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a folder containing the corporate documents that identified Rodriguez Holdings, LLC, as the majority shareholder in the acquisition fund. The papers were crisp and official, bearing the seals and signatures that confirmed my ownership stake. "There seems to be some confusion about the ownership structure of this transaction," I said calmly, placing the documents on the table where everyone could see them. "Rodriguez Holdings, LLC, holds a controlling interest in the fund that's acquiring Morrison Industries." Marcus glanced at the documents dismissively. "So? We've been transparent about our investor structure. What's your point?" The question hung in the air like smoke before an explosion. This was the moment I had been building toward for 2 weeks, the culmination of every slight and humiliation Marcus had inflicted since my first day at the firm. "The point," I said, my voice steady and professional, "is that Rodriguez Holdings LLC is my company. I am the majority shareholder in the fund that's acquiring Morrison Industries, which means that as of today, I will have controlling interest in a $200 million manufacturing company." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic noise from Central Park West. 20 pairs of eyes stared at me, some in shock, others in disbelief, all trying to process the implications of what I had just revealed. Marcus's face went through a series of transformations, from confusion to disbelief, to a kind of pale recognition that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The pen in his hand trembled slightly as he set it down on the mahogany table. "That's impossible," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're a paralegal. You work for me." "I am a paralegal," I confirmed, "and for the past 2 weeks, I have been working for you. But as of this moment, the dynamic has changed somewhat. You are now working for a company that I control." Robert Morrison was the first to find his voice. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, his tone respectful but curious, "perhaps you could explain how this situation came about." I nodded, grateful for the opportunity to provide context that would make the revelation seem less like a confrontation and more like a business discussion. I invested my military settlement and savings in a diversified portfolio that included private equity funds specializing in manufacturing companies. Rodriguez Holdings was created to manage those investments, and it turned out that one of the funds I invested in was the entity acquiring your company. The explanation was truthful but incomplete. It didn't convey the weeks of careful research I had done, the strategic conversations with Robert Morrison, or the detailed analysis of Marcus's competence and character. But it provided enough information to establish my legitimacy without revealing the full scope of my preparation. Sarah Chen leaned forward in her chair, her expression a mixture of admiration and amazement. "You've known about this for how long?" she asked. "I discovered the connection during my first week here," I said. "I spent the following weeks learning as much as possible about the transaction and the companies involved." Marcus was still struggling to process the implications. "This is insane," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "You can't just... You're disabled. You use a cane." The comment landed like a physical blow, not because it hurt, but because it revealed so clearly the prejudice and ignorance that had shaped his treatment of me from the beginning. He couldn't reconcile his assumptions about disability with the reality of competence and success. "Yes, I use a cane," I said quietly. "I was injured in Afghanistan while serving my country. That injury has no bearing on my ability to make sound business decisions or manage a complex investment portfolio." One of Robert Morrison's lawyers spoke up, his voice careful and measured. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is certainly an unusual situation. What are your intentions regarding the company's management and operations?" It was the right question, and I was prepared for it. My primary concern is ensuring that Morrison Industries continues to thrive as a manufacturer of high-quality aerospace components. That means preserving the skilled workforce, maintaining the company's reputation for excellence, and making strategic investments in research and development. The contrast with Marcus's approach couldn't have been more stark. Where he had talked about layoffs and cost-cutting, I was discussing investment and growth. Where he had dismissed the company's employees as, quote, dead weight, I was recognizing them as valuable assets. Marcus finally found his voice, though it was strained and uncertain. "You can't be serious about this. You don't have the experience to run a manufacturing company. You've been a paralegal for 2 weeks. "You're right," I said calmly. "I don't have direct experience running a manufacturing company, but I do have 22 years of experience managing complex operations under pressure, coordinating with diverse teams, and making decisions that affect hundreds of people. I also have extensive experience in logistics and supply chain management, which are critical components of manufacturing operations." Robert Morrison was nodding slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Military logistics experience would be quite valuable in our industry," he said. "We work with defense contractors regularly, and understanding military procurement processes is a significant advantage." Patricia Williams had been silent throughout the exchange, but now she spoke up. "Elena, is this why you've been so focused these past 2 weeks? You've been preparing for this moment?" "In part," I acknowledged, "but I've also been genuinely learning the job and trying to contribute to the firm's success. The paralegal work has been valuable experience, and I've enjoyed working with you." Marcus was still reeling from the revelation, but his natural combativeness was beginning to reassert itself. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Even if what you're saying is true, You can't just walk in here and take over a deal I've been working on for months. I'm not taking over the deal, I corrected. The deal is proceeding exactly as planned. The only thing that's changed is your understanding of who the ultimate decision-maker is. The distinction was important, and several people around the table seemed to recognize its significance. I wasn't sabotaging the transaction or trying to prevent it from closing. I was simply revealing a reality that had existed all along but had been hidden from Marcus's view. One of the associates from Marcus's team raised a tentative hand. "What does this mean for the firm's relationship with Caldwell Enterprises?" he asked. It was a practical question that got to the heart of the immediate implications. Caldwell, Harrison, and Associates had been representing Marcus's company in the acquisition, but if I was actually the controlling shareholder, their client relationship became significantly more complex. "That's something we'll need to work out," I said diplomatically. "There are obviously some conflicts of interest that will need to be addressed. But my immediate focus is on completing this transaction and ensuring a smooth transition for Morrison Industries." Marcus slammed his hand on the table, causing several people to jump. "This is unacceptable," he said, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You deliberately deceived me. You let me believe. You made me look like a fool." The accusation hung in the air, and I felt the weight of every person's attention as they waited for my response. This was the crucial moment, the point where I could either escalate the confrontation or diffuse it in a way that demonstrated leadership and maturity. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I never deceived you about anything. I told you from the beginning that I was a military veteran with experience in logistics and operations. I completed every assignment you gave me accurately and professionally. The only thing I didn't share was information about my personal investments, which frankly wasn't relevant to my role as a paralegal." The response was measured and factual, but it also contained an implicit criticism of his behavior over the past 2 weeks. By focusing on my professionalism and competence, I was highlighting his failure to recognize those qualities because of his prejudice about my disability. Robert Morrison cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the business at hand. "Perhaps we should focus on moving forward," he suggested. "Ms. Rodriguez, what are your immediate plans for the company's leadership and operations?" It was exactly the right question, and I was grateful for his diplomatic intervention. "I'd like to retain the existing management structure initially," I said. "Your team understands the business better than anyone else, and continuity will be important during the transition. However, I do want to review some of the proposed changes, particularly the workforce reductions." Marcus's face went from flushed to pale as he realized that his plans for the company were now subject to my approval. All the aggressive cost-cutting measures he had been planning, all the layoffs he had been anticipating, would now require the consent of someone who had fundamentally different priorities. "You can't just change everything," he protested. "I've spent months developing the integration plan. The investors are expecting specific returns based on the efficiency improvements I've outlined." "The investors," I said gently, "are primarily me. And I'm more interested in long-term sustainability than short-term cost-cutting." The simple statement contained everything Marcus needed to know about how different our approaches to business really were. He had built his career on aggressive tactics designed to maximize immediate profits, while I was focused on building something that would last. Sarah Chen spoke up again, her voice thoughtful. "Ms. Rodriguez, what does this mean for the legal representation of the transaction? Obviously, there are some conflicts that need to be addressed." It was a smart question that demonstrated her understanding of the complex legal and ethical issues involved. The firm had been representing Marcus's interests in the acquisition, but if I was actually the controlling party, their loyalties became divided. "I think we'll need to bring in independent counsel to sort out the representation issues," I said. "But that's a problem for after the closing. Right now, I want to focus on completing the transaction and ensuring that Morrison Industries has the leadership it needs going forward." One of the lawyers from Robert Morrison's team leaned forward. "Ms. Rodriguez, we'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your vision for the company in more detail. There are operational questions that will need to be addressed soon." "Absolutely," I agreed. "I'd also like to meet with the senior management team at Morrison as soon as possible. Understanding their perspective on the company's challenges and opportunities will be crucial for making good decisions." Marcus was following the conversation with growing alarm as he realized that he was being systematically excluded from discussions about a company he had expected to control. "Wait a minute," he interrupted. "I'm still the managing partner of Caldwell Enterprises. I still have operational responsibility for this acquisition." "Actually," I said carefully, "that's something we'll need to discuss. The management structure of the acquisition will need to be reviewed in light of the ownership realities." The implication was clear, without being explicitly stated. Marcus's role in managing the acquisition was now subject to my approval, and given his behavior over the past 2 weeks, that approval was far from certain. Robert Morrison stood up, signaling that he was ready to move the proceedings toward completion. "I think we should finish executing the documents," he said. "The ownership questions don't affect the basic structure of the transaction, and we've already spent considerable time and resources getting to this point." It was a practical suggestion that acknowledged the complexity of the situation while focusing on the immediate need to complete the deal. The personal and professional implications could be sorted out later, but the business transaction itself was solid and should proceed. I nodded my agreement. "I think that makes sense. Let's complete the closing and then address the operational questions separately." Marcus looked around the room desperately, as if searching for someone who would support his position or help him regain control of the situation. But the other participants in the transaction were focused on completing their professional responsibilities, not on managing his personal crisis. The document execution proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Signatures were applied, notarizations completed, and final verifications made. Each step moved the transaction closer to completion, while simultaneously moving Marcus further from the position of authority he had expected to occupy. As the final documents were signed and the transaction officially closed, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond the business deal itself. The past 2 weeks had been a journey of discovery, not just about my financial situation, but about my own capabilities and priorities. Marcus sat in his chair, staring at the documents that had just transferred control of a $200 million company to someone he had spent weeks dismissing and humiliating. His expensive suit looked rumpled, his confident demeanor replaced by something approaching shock. "Congratulations," Robert Morrison said to me, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "I look forward to working with you to ensure Morrison Industries continues to thrive." "Thank you," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm committed to honoring the legacy your family has built while positioning the company for future growth." The contrast with Marcus's approach was implicit but unmistakable. Where he had talked about dismantling and restructuring, I was speaking about building and growing. Where he had dismissed the company's history as irrelevant sentiment, I was recognizing it as a foundation for future success. As the meeting broke up and people began gathering their documents, Patricia Williams approached me with an expression of amazement and respect. "Elena," she said quietly, "I knew there was something different about you, but I never imagined anything like this." "I'm still the same person who's been working next to you for the past 2 weeks," I said. "The only thing that's changed is your understanding of my circumstances." She nodded slowly. "But those circumstances change everything, don't they? You won't be coming back to work as a paralegal." It was a statement rather than a question, and she was right. My career at Caldwell, Harrison & Associates was effectively over, but a new chapter was beginning that would be far more challenging and rewarding than anything I could have achieved in the paralegal role. "No," I acknowledged. "I think my time as a paralegal has come to an end. But I've learned a lot these past 2 weeks, and I'm grateful for the experience." Marcus overheard our conversation and approached with a mixture of anger and desperation in his eyes. "You can't just walk away from this," he said. "I have contracts, obligations, commitments to other investors. This deal was supposed to be my breakthrough." "The deal is still your breakthrough," I pointed out. "You successfully negotiated the acquisition of a valuable company. The fact that you didn't realize who you were negotiating with doesn't change the professional accomplishment." But even as I said it, we both knew that wasn't true. Marcus's reputation in the legal and business communities would be permanently damaged by the revelation that he had spent weeks humiliating and dismissing the very person who held controlling interest in his biggest deal. Sarah Chen lingered as the room emptied, clearly wanting to say something but uncertain how to approach the conversation. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. "Ms. Rodriguez," she said formally, I want to apologize for not speaking up more forcefully when he was treating you the way he did. I should have said something. Her apology was genuine and thoughtful, recognizing both the moral dimension of the situation and her own role as a bystander. Thank you, I said. But you did speak up when you could, and that mattered. Creating change in corporate culture is difficult, especially for junior employees. What you did today, she continued, it wasn't just about business, was it? It was about proving that his assumptions about you were wrong. She was perceptive, recognizing that the revelation had been carefully timed and orchestrated to maximum effect. In part, I acknowledged. But it was also about protecting Morrison Industries from management decisions that would have damaged the company and hurt its employees. As the conference room finally emptied, leaving only Marcus and myself, the full weight of what had transpired began to settle in. For 2 weeks he had used his position and authority to humiliate me, based on his prejudiced assumptions about disability. Now, in a matter of minutes, those assumptions had been completely overturned. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice containing a mixture of threat and desperation. "I'll fight this. I'll find a way to challenge your ownership, question your competence, something." I looked at him calmly, feeling neither anger nor satisfaction, just a kind of professional clarity about what needed to happen next. "Marcus," I said, "you have a choice to make. You can spend your energy fighting a reality you can't change, or you can figure out how to work within the new circumstances. I'd recommend the latter." "Work for you?" he asked, incredulity clear in his voice. "After everything that's happened?" "Work with me," I corrected. "If you're willing to approach the relationship with respect and professionalism. But that would require acknowledging that your behavior over the past 2 weeks was inappropriate and counterproductive." The offer was genuine, though I suspected he wouldn't be able to accept it. Marcus's ego and his prejudices were too deeply ingrained to allow him to work effectively with someone he had systematically underestimated and humiliated. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. Finally, he shook his head. "This is insane," he muttered, and walked out of the conference room. I remained in the empty room for several minutes, processing everything that had happened and beginning to plan for the challenges ahead. Owning a controlling interest in Morrison Industries was just the beginning. Now I had to prove that I could actually manage and grow a complex manufacturing business. The view from the conference room windows showed Central Park in its autumn glory, the trees displaying the kind of vibrant colors that make Manhattan feel magical, despite its concrete and steel. Somewhere in that view was a metaphor for transformation and renewal, for the way dramatic change could reveal beauty that had been hidden beneath the surface. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Santos. "How did it go today?" She knew about the merger closing, but not about the dramatic revelation that had just occurred. I typed back, "Better than expected. I'll call you tonight." Her response came immediately. "I'm proud of you, whatever happened." The simple message of support reminded me that this victory wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger story about overcoming prejudice and proving that disability doesn't define capability. Every veteran struggling with the transition to civilian life, every person fighting against assumptions about their limitations, had a stake in what had happened in that conference room. As I gathered my documents and prepared to leave, William, the security guard, appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said respectfully, "I heard about what happened upstairs. Congratulations." News traveled fast in a law firm, especially news as dramatic as what had occurred during the merger closing. "Thank you, William," I said. "I have a feeling things are going to be different around here." He smiled, the expression of a man who had seen enough of corporate politics to appreciate a genuine upset. "Different is good," he said. "Sometimes different is exactly what a place needs." The elevator ride down to the lobby gave me 32 floors to think about the future. In the space of a single morning, I had gone from being a paralegal struggling to prove herself to being the owner of a multi-million-dollar company. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and absolutely terrifying. But as the elevator reached the lobby and I walked toward the exit, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my injury, a sense of unlimited possibility. For the first time in years, I wasn't fighting against other people's assumptions about my limitations. I was free to define my own path forward. The October air outside the building was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of winter and the energy of a city that never stopped moving. Somewhere across town, the employees of Morrison Industries were going about their daily work, unaware that their company had just changed hands, and that their new owner was committed to preserving both their jobs and their dignity. Marcus Caldwell would eventually recover from his humiliation and find other deals to pursue, other companies to acquire. But he would never again be able to look at someone with a disability and assume he understood the limits of their capability. The lesson had been taught in the most direct and memorable way possible. And I had work to do. A company to run, employees to protect, and a future to build that would prove once and for all that strength comes in many forms, and that the most dangerous assumption is the one that underestimates the person standing right in front of you. 3 months had passed since that October morning when everything changed, and the transformation at Morrison Industries had been nothing short of remarkable. Walking through the manufacturing floor on a crisp January afternoon, I could feel the energy that permeated every corner of the facility. The sound of precision machinery hummed with renewed purpose, and the faces of the workers reflected a confidence that had been missing for years. My first decision as majority owner had been to cancel all proposed layoffs and instead invest in employee training and equipment upgrades. The decision had raised eyebrows among financial analysts who expected the typical cost-cutting approach, but the results spoke for themselves. Productivity was up 18%, quality defects had dropped to near zero, and customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Robert Morrison had stayed on as CEO, bringing decades of institutional knowledge and a genuine understanding of what made the company special. Our working relationship had developed into something remarkable, a partnership that bridged generational and experiential gaps. He understood manufacturing and customer relationships. I brought strategic thinking and operational discipline from my military background. The research and development division that Marcus had planned to eliminate had become our crown jewel. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the head of R&D, had been quietly developing revolutionary improvements to aerospace component manufacturing that could transform the entire industry. Under Marcus's cost-cutting approach, these innovations would have been shelved indefinitely. Instead, we had doubled the R&D budget and fast-tracked 3 major projects. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of the business had nearly cost Morrison Industries its most valuable asset. His focus on immediate profitability would have destroyed the very innovation that was now driving our competitive advantage and attracting new customers. Word of the merger closing had spread quickly through New York's legal and business communities. The story of a disabled veteran revealing herself as the majority owner of a company while working as a paralegal had become legendary, though the details often became embellished in the retelling. Some versions made me sound like a corporate spy. Others portrayed the situation as an elaborate revenge scheme. The reality was simpler and more complex than the rumors suggested. I had genuinely taken the paralegal position to learn about corporate law while pursuing my degree. The discovery of my ownership stake had been accidental, but my decision to reveal it publicly had been calculated to maximum effect. Most importantly, the outcome had been about protecting a company and its employees, not just personal vindication. Marcus Caldwell had left Caldwell, Harrison and Associates within a week of the merger closing. The managing partners had given him little choice, recognizing that his credibility in the legal community had been irreparably damaged. Word had spread that he had spent weeks humiliating and dismissing a client who held a controlling interest in his biggest deal. No amount of legal skill could compensate for such spectacular misjudgment. His departure had created opportunities for others at the firm. Sarah Chen had been promoted to senior associate and was now leading several major transactions. Her willingness to speak up during difficult moments, even in small ways, had been noted by the partners. Patricia Williams had been offered a position at Morrison Industries as head of corporate compliance, a role that recognized her expertise and gave her the respect she deserved. The changes at Morrison Industries extended far beyond financial performance. The company culture had transformed from one of anxiety and uncertainty to one of innovation and growth. Employees who had been worried about layoffs were now participating in expansion planning. The union leadership, initially skeptical of new ownership, had become strong supporters after seeing our commitment to job security and worker development. Dr. Walsh knocked on my office door, her face bright with excitement. She carried a folder containing what looked like technical specifications and test results. At 38, she was a brilliant engineer who had spent 15 years developing next-generation manufacturing processes. Under the previous ownership structure, her work had been undervalued and underfunded. "Elena, you need to see this," she said, spreading documents across my desk. "The ceramic composite project has exceeded all our projections. We're looking at components that are 40% lighter than current standards while maintaining superior strength characteristics. The breakthrough represented years of patient research and development, the kind of long-term thinking that Marcus's approach would have eliminated. The applications were staggering. Aerospace companies could reduce aircraft weight while improving safety margins, leading to better fuel efficiency and enhanced performance. What's the timeline for commercial production?" I asked, studying the test data that showed consistent results across multiple prototype iterations. 6 months for initial production capability, 18 months for full-scale manufacturing, Dr. Walsh replied. "But Elena, the really exciting part is the patent portfolio. We're looking at intellectual property that could generate licensing revenue for decades." The financial implications were significant, but I was more interested in the strategic advantages. Morrison Industries was positioned to become an industry leader rather than just another manufacturer competing on price. We were creating value through innovation rather than destroying it through cost-cutting. My phone rang with a call from Robert Morrison, who was visiting our facility in Texas. "Elena, I just finished the quarterly review with the Houston team. Production efficiency is up 22%, and they're ahead of schedule on the Air Force contract. The military contracts had been another area where my background provided unexpected advantages. My understanding of defense procurement processes and quality requirements had helped Morrison navigate complex compliance issues that had previously caused delays and cost overruns. The result was stronger relationships with military customers and more profitable contracts." "That's excellent news," I said. "How are the new hires working out?" "Better than expected. The training program you designed is producing technicians who are ready to contribute immediately. We're actually having trouble keeping up with the demand for our training graduates from other companies." The training program had been inspired by military education models that emphasized hands-on learning and systematic skill development. Instead of viewing employee development as a cost, we treated it as an investment in both individual growth and company capability. The program had become so successful that other manufacturers were asking us to train their workers. A knock on my office door interrupted our conversation. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, her expression professional but friendly. Since Marcus's departure, she had maintained contact with Morrison Industries on various legal matters, but this visit seemed different. "Elena, do you have a few minutes? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." I finished my call with Robert and invited Sarah to sit down. Over the past few months, she had become more than just a legal contact. She had proven herself to be someone with genuine integrity and sound business judgment. "I have a proposition for you," she said, her tone confident but respectful. "I'm considering leaving Caldwell, Harrison & Associates to start my own practice. I'd like Morrison Industries to be my first major client." The proposal made sense on multiple levels. Sarah understood our business and had demonstrated her competence on several complex transactions. More importantly, she shared our values regarding employee treatment and long-term thinking. Having her as our primary legal counsel would ensure continuity and alignment with our corporate philosophy. "What kind of practice are you envisioning?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Corporate law with a focus on companies that prioritize employee welfare and sustainable growth," she said. "There's a market for legal services that align with progressive business practices. Too many firms still operate under the old model of maximizing short-term profits, regardless of human costs." Her vision reflected a broader shift in business culture that I had observed since taking control of Morrison Industries. Younger professionals were increasingly attracted to companies that demonstrated social responsibility and long-term thinking. The old model of aggressive cost-cutting and employee exploitation was being challenged by a new generation of leaders who understood that sustainable success required different approaches. "I'd be interested in discussing this further," I said, "but I'd want to make sure you understand what you're getting into. Morrison Industries is committed to being a different kind of company, which sometimes means making decisions that Wall Street doesn't understand." Sarah smiled, the expression of someone who had found her professional calling. "That's exactly why I want to work with you." What happened with Marcus wasn't just about exposing his prejudice. It was about demonstrating that there are better ways to do business. The conversation was interrupted by a call from Dr. Santos, my therapist, who had been following the developments at Morrison Industries with professional interest and personal pride. Our sessions had evolved from trauma counseling to strategic planning discussions as I navigated the challenges of running a major company. "Elena, I saw the article in Manufacturing today about Morrison's innovations. How are you handling the increased visibility and pressure?" The article had been one of several media pieces highlighting Morrison Industries, transformation, and my unusual path to corporate leadership. While the attention was generally positive, it also brought scrutiny and expectations that could be overwhelming. "It's challenging," I admitted. "Every decision gets analyzed and second-guessed. People are watching to see if a disabled veteran can really run a manufacturing company." "And what do you think about that pressure?" "I think it's an opportunity to prove that diversity in leadership brings real advantages. My military background gives me perspectives that traditional business leaders might miss. The key is staying focused on results rather than perceptions." Dr. Santos had been instrumental in helping me develop the emotional resilience needed for corporate leadership. The transition from military service to business ownership had required learning new skills while adapting existing ones to civilian contexts. Her guidance had been invaluable in managing both the psychological and practical aspects of this transformation. After ending the call, I spent time reviewing financial reports that showed Morrison Industries' continued growth and profitability. The numbers told a story of strategic investment paying dividends, of employee engagement driving productivity, and of innovation creating competitive advantages. But behind the statistics were hundreds of individual stories of workers whose lives had been positively affected by our approach to business. Maria Gonzalez had been scheduled for layoff under Marcus's plan, but had instead been promoted to shift supervisor after demonstrating exceptional leadership during a production crisis. James Thompson, a veteran machinist nearing retirement, had been retained as a trainer for new employees, passing on decades of institutional knowledge that would have been lost under the old approach. Dr. Walsh had been given the resources and support to pursue research that was now positioning Morrison Industries as an industry innovator. Each of these decisions had been made based on recognizing human potential rather than treating people as disposable resources. The approach required patience and investment, but the returns had exceeded all expectations. Morrison Industries had become proof that treating employees, well, wasn't just morally right, it was strategically smart. The late afternoon sun streamed through my office windows, illuminating the photographs on my desk that showed Morrison Industries, facilities, employees, and products. Mixed among the business images were pictures from my military service, reminders of the experiences that had shaped my approach to leadership and decision-making. My assistant knocked on the door to remind me of a video conference with potential investors from Germany who were interested in licensing our ceramic composite technology. The international interest in Morrison's innovations had grown exponentially, creating opportunities for expansion that would have been impossible under Marcus's cost-cutting approach. As I prepared for the meeting, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in less than a year. The scared and uncertain veteran who had started as a paralegal had been transformed into a confident business leader responsible for hundreds of employees and millions in revenue. The journey had required confronting prejudice, overcoming self-doubt, and learning to trust in capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. But perhaps the most important lesson had been that strength comes in many forms, and that the most dangerous mistake is underestimating someone based on assumptions about their limitations. Marcus Caldwell had learned that lesson in the most public and humiliating way possible. But the real victory wasn't his downfall. It was the success that followed. Morrison Industries continued to thrive, its employees continued to prosper, and the industry continued to benefit from innovations that would have been lost under a different approach to leadership. The story that had begun with workplace humiliation had evolved into a testament to the power of inclusive leadership and long-term thinking. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.